Hello, 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 hello. Hello, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a minute. I want to make sure that you all get out at a decent time. I'm sure that we're going to want to leave a lot of room for the Q&A part of this particular debate if you're here because you're interested in... Oh, right, we have music on. I was about to yell at someone for keeping their phone on, and now I realize it's us. Thank you. I'm sure that it's going to be a lively debate, and I'm sure the audience is going to want to ask a lot of questions, so I'll make this as quick as possible so we can just dive straight into this. A few things. So welcome to our first debate of the spring season. We are the UA Debate Series. Give yourselves a round of applause for coming out because we have a full house here, which is great. A few things that I want to let everyone know. So first of all, we began this whole entire program last year, and we've been slowly but surely growing and growing and growing, and it seems like people are getting more interested, which is wonderful. If you are interested in any of our future debates, you can follow us on our social media at UA Debates. UA Debate Series? Yeah, UA Debate Series on Twitter, on Instagram, or on Facebook. That's where you would get the best information for all of our future debates. And hopefully you'll like what you see. You can also go to sbs.arizona.edu/UA Debate Series to find out more about our program. And you can also donate if you really, really like what you see. You can throw us some money, which would be wonderful. We send our students around to compete in tournaments, which is where most of that money ends up going, as well as the wonderful setup we have behind us. I want to say a quick thank you to our interns, who are the hardest working group of students I've ever met in my entire life. So a round of applause for them, because this whole entire thing would not be possible without them. So a quick note about tonight's particular topic before we get into everything. So we put a lot of work into trying to make sure that we're wording our resolutions in such a way that they are debatable, that you can all understand the controversy behind them, but that also that everyone understands what goes into them. In case anyone in here is not totally well-versed on Title IX and exactly what it has to do with an issue like sexual misconduct on campuses, we're particularly going to be discussing Title IX in the wake of the 2011 Dear Colleague letters that were sent out by the Office of Civil Rights, and how it is that sort of has affected the tone of Title IX and sexual misconduct on campuses. So we'll be talking a lot about that, although, of course, our debaters are going to give you a much more comprehensive history into the whole entire issue. What you have in front of you as you walked in, you'll have cards. You should have 3 different cards. Oxford-style debate demands that you vote both before and after the resolution. So rather than having the winner be declared by who ends up getting the most votes, it's who ends up changing the audience's mind the most. So we'll find out what you thought about this resolution beforehand and afterwards. The wording of the resolution is Title IX should not be used to address campus sexual misconduct. So if you are in favor of that resolution and you do not think that Title IX should be used to address that particular issue, then make sure that you pass a green card to either Brianna, who's in the white over here, or Taylor, who's in the blue over there. Make sure you pass a green card to her if you are in favor of that resolution. If you are against that resolution and you do think that Title IX should be used to address campus sexual misconduct, please pass your red or pinkish kind of card that you have. And if you're undecided or you don't really know a whole lot about the issue, or you're neutral and you're just waiting to hear the excellent arguments before you make up your mind, then pass a yellow card to either Brianna or to Taylor. So do that before we hear the opening statements, because we want to make sure that you're completely unbiased. And you can do that now, and Brianna and Taylor, you can go and collect them. I will ask one favor of everyone, just so that we can make sure that the votes stay as they should be. If for whatever reason you have an emergency and you need to leave early and you did vote, please go up to either Taylor or Brianna and let them know that you're leaving and how you voted, so that they can cross your vote off the list, so we can have a really as accurate as possible voting system going into this particular resolution. That said, the way that this is going to work is we're going to have 3 rounds. The first round is opening statements, where we'll hear opening statements from both the affirmative team and the negative team on this particular resolution. 2 statements each. They will be 6 minutes and 4 minutes long. Afterwards, we'll have a cross-examination round where they'll get to address each other, and our wonderful moderator, Kwejo, will be able to moderate and ask them questions, and we'll also be able to get questions from the audience, which, again, we'll make plenty of room for. And then we'll have a closing statement from one member of each team for 6 minutes each. So hopefully this will go nice and smooth. Please make sure that you are as respectful as possible. Silence your cell phones, because we don't want to disturb anybody. But other than that, let's get going with our first spring debate of the spring season. Thank you very much.
All right. So thank you all so much for coming out once again. Thank you, Ted, for introducing me again. My name is Kwejo Walker. I'm going to be the moderator for tonight's debate. Really quickly before we get started, we wanted to let the debaters introduce themselves really quickly. So first we're going to go through the affirmative side, and then we're going to go through the negative side. So Sam, go ahead and start, please.
Hi, I'm Sam. Everyone, thanks for coming out.
I'm RJ. Thank you again for being here.
And I'm Juan.
I'm Kayla. Thank you guys for coming out tonight.
I'm Emma. Thank you, guys. I'm Casey. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Okay, so again, as Ted said, the format of this debate, right now what we're going to do is we're going to go into our opening statements first. It's going to be a 6-minute speech from the affirmative side. Sam's going to come up to the podium, and let's get started.
All right, thanks, Kwejo, and thanks again, everyone, for being here. We're excited for this event. So, the motion before us tonight is Title IX should not be used to address campus sexual misconduct. It's important moving into this evening's debate that my teammates and I acknowledge the controversial nature of 3 men debating with 3 women about sexual misconduct, as well as our male privilege, and that we may not have been subjected to some situations and forms of oppression that we'll be discussing tonight. So we'd like to make it clear that we intend to make this an inclusive space for all the students debating tonight and the audience listening. With this in mind, we stand in firm affirmation of the motion that Title IX should not be used to address campus sexual misconduct. I know that our team, the opposition, and the audience all want to live in a campus environment that's completely free of sexual misconduct. It's our view that it would be infeasible to formulate a plan that would eradicate sexual misconduct on campus from the scope of our concerns in the modern era. Our team advocates for a system that handles cases of sexual misconduct in the most moral, consistent, and ethically sound manner. After hearing a bit about Title IX, I'd like to spend some time discussing the background a little further. Title IX was initially formed in 1972 to develop equal extracurricular and academic opportunities between men and women. Title IX also focused on preventing sex discrimination in education. It served as a policy that promoted equality at universities for funding and opportunities, and generally fulfilled this purpose well. In 2011, the Dear Colleague letter, released by the Department of Education, mandated that campuses thoroughly address any issues of sexual misconduct in order to maintain their eligibility for federal funding. This letter meant that colleges were being forced to adapt and apply their Title IX policies to handle issues of sexual misconduct on campus. In the wake of this threat, colleges overcorrected their policies by creating policies that blatantly disregard due process and overlook the needs and consolation of the victim while assuming the guilt of the accused. This resulted in a paradigm shift of sexual culture from the hands and discretion of the students to the bureaucratic administrators at universities. The practices of our policymakers and Title IX officers after this transition have led to our students and campuses to stigmatize Title IX matters as being chaotic and inconsistent. The misguided investigatory efforts by the Office for Civil Rights, who's in charge of overseeing Title IX investigations, leaves victims feeling overlooked and mistreated. Also, university and OCR-led investigations are often carried out with a bias towards the offender because schools will do whatever they can to avoid ridicule and bad publicity from one of their students, athletes, professors, or administrators being labeled as a sex criminal. The investigations by university Title IX officers are also problematic as they fail to focus on the details and evidence pertinent to the specific case that initiated the investigation, instead conducting a comprehensive investigation on the culture of the university in question. Some of these investigations take 2 to 3 years, leaving victims feeling little closure and communities seeing little progress. This is going on because schools are afraid to question OCR, since they hold the purse strings for their federal funding. The Title IX offices are essentially forced to take extreme action in response to any sexual misconduct case that may arise on campus, regardless of the specifics or severity. This status quo response to Title IX cases belittles the value of everyone involved. And worse yet, universities immediately rush to settle with the victims and suppress their stories, silencing their voice and making them feel like the cause of the issue. Under Title IX, victims are made to feel like statistics and don't get closure or justice. They feel like a cog in the bureaucratic machine that administrators just want to brush under the rug. The publicity and chaos that ensues as the result of a Title IX case on campus undermines the narrative of the victim. As we move into our case, it will become clear that we need to drastically shift our focus towards advocacy for the victim, due process for the accused, and consistent and ethical procedures to investigate sexual misconduct allegations. When universities themselves are at the helm of regulating sexual misconduct, it only opens the door for corruption and lack of follow-through. The role that universities should have in sexual misconduct cases is a neutral party that provides safety measures for all parties involved. When victims feel their safety is being compromised, the school system ought to respond by changing housing arrangements, class schedules, safe rides, providing grief counseling, and other appropriate accommodations. We must not continue to subscribe to a system where our universities are caught in a vicious cycle of heinous policies, resulting in people being overlooked by bureaucratic priorities. Faculty are mandated reporters in the current system to their own Title IX office whenever they become aware of allegations of sexual misconduct. This policy often forces students to be thrown into these publicity nightmares and spotlights a traumatizing experience that they wanted to share in the confidence of a faculty mentor. We need to shift this norm to student-run systems with faculty advisors who are psychologists and therapists trained in grief counseling and have the resources to explore next steps with the victims. These safe spaces for individuals involved in sexual misconduct are crucial to incentivize students to actually come forward, share their story and their experiences and opinions, and have their voice heard in an environment with healthy advocates who will not sensationalize their story for bureaucratic reasons. These safe spaces should be equipped with advising from legal representatives and have clear communication with the police, who will investigate any charges that victims want to press. Students have the capacity to be the cornerstone of programs and initiatives that aim to end rape culture on our campuses. Please stand with us and support the plan to transition away from these overarching policies that taint our university culture and exacerbate personal crises in the lives of our community. As we progress through the course of this evening's debate, I urge you audience members to remember the long overdue improvements that we will get from a switch from university-enforced Title IX policy to a system with student initiatives, fair representation, justice, and equality for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. We're now going to go on to the first speech in the negation for the motion. Once again, Title IX should not be used to address campus sexual misconduct. Kayla.
Hello, everybody. Thank you guys for coming out today. One second. Can I borrow your phone? Sorry about that. Alrighty. So we are here to discuss whether or not Title IX should be used to address sexual misconduct. We're defining sexual misconduct as sexual harassment, sexual assault, and any conduct of a sexual nature that is without consent or has the effect of threatening or intimidating the person against whom such conduct is directed. We believe that Title IX is a foundation for addressing campus sexual misconduct and a key component in addressing campus sexual misconduct. We, however, concede that the language of Title IX is flawed and that it does not properly address the concerns of students and teachers, and because of this flawed language, it has been implemented differently across many campuses across the country. One of the main reasons why Title IX is flawed is due to the fact that progressive bills such as this one, in their infancy, are often created with such vague language that allows them to be passed. As time goes on, bills such as Title IX are expected to be expanded on and revised to fit the time period that they are in. Our plan is to revise Title IX. The first way we will do this is to rewrite the law to be less vague. One way we are doing this is by addressing the issue of varying definitions of consent. We will revert to the federal definition of consent as outlined in the 10 U.S. Code 920, Article 120 on rape and sexual assault generally, which defines consent as means of freely given agreement to the conduct at issue by a competent person. Any expression or lack of consent through words or conduct means there is no consent. The second way that we will change Title IX is to have federally funded investigative teams of attorneys, a review panel, and other trained personnel to conduct formal investigations and allow for due process. A review panel might consist of victims' advocates, forensic examiners, prosecutors, and others, including representatives from a crime laboratory, restorative justice rehabilitation processes for offenders. Each school will choose a team, but it must be approved by the state government. The objective is to discuss and review these cases to determine the most appropriate response for victims whose sexual assaults who are not likely to result in successful prosecution, and for survivors who can also opt out of the legal system entirely and be provided with other alternative resources. If their assault is not likely to result in prosecution, other avenues can be presented to individuals, such as their other legal options, counseling, educational classes, etc. This allows for a more individualized approach for each survivor based on their situation. It also provides an avenue for those who have been accused to receive education on consent and sex, be given due process, given all of their legal options, and are given protections against false reporting. By implementing these practices, schools can be held federally accountable for investigating sexual assault cases on their campus. This federal standard will be set so that all schools can implement policy that has the same standards and errors will not be made. It is essential to allow schools to have the ability to be a source of help for students and faculty who have experienced sexual misconduct. Teams such as the ones that we propose help to protect schools from lawsuits and allow them an easier process to handle sexual misconduct cases. By providing them with many avenues to report and receive resources, victims are more likely to find a place where they are comfortable reporting or not reporting. Given the violating nature of sexual misconduct, it is important that those who have experienced it retain as much control as possible over the actions taken in response. There are already policies like Title VII, which is used to prevent sexual misconduct in the workplace. So naturally, it would make sense to have these policies for schools as well. A model similar to ours is being currently used at Yale University. They currently have multiple options for students reporting through the University-wide Committee on Sexual Misconduct and SHARE, Information, Advocacy, and Support. Their university-wide committee is staffed by faculty and students who are supervised by impartial fact finders who then report their findings to Title IX officers. We are interested in expanding this committee to include prosecutors, parole officers, forensic examiners, and other trained professionals listed earlier. This would make committees such as these even more effective at following through with mandated investigations of complaints. The SHARE program coordinates with medical treatment, mental health services, and it assists with initiating a complaint and provides other resources for survivors. The affirmative team has mentioned that their plan is to allow students to have student-run policies and student-run programs where they can receive resources and to have them facilitated by faculty. But the reality of that situation is you can't enforce schools to do anything unless it's federally mandated. So the affirmative team mentioned that schools ought to do this, not that they have to do this. But by using our plan, we are ensuring that schools have to investigate. They have to investigate if the case is brought to them and the survivor wants to prosecute. They have to be held accountable. They don't have the option to sweep things under the rug, and it actually protects schools more by having this system in place rather than having it be unlawed chaos. We acknowledge that the system is chaotic right now, but under our plan, we are able to fix that and provide students with more resources that will actually be there for them. According to the affirmative, they want a world in which all schools ought to do this, where they should do this, where students should be doing this. We want schools to have to do this, to have to protect their students. And although both sides agree that Title IX is flawed, the plan that we propose forces universities to be held accountable and to investigate all sexual misconduct cases. A vote for the negative is a vote for a system that provides so many resources to students and ensures that universities are providing these resources. If we focus on having no federal protections and only rely on funneling money only to student resources, we would be encountering many of the same problems that we are currently having. The only way to properly fix the issues currently at hand is to revise Title IX, not do away with the protections completely. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kayla.
Absolutely.
So we are halfway through round one. Right now, we're going to be going back to the affirmative side. They're going to have another opening statement. It's going to be 4 minutes long. And what's going to happen is they're going to extend their case as well as offer some counter arguments to the negative case that was brought up. So now, RJ, you do have the floor.
Hello, guys. Thank you for being here. All good? All right. So Title IX came to be in 1972, and when it started, there was high hopes that it would give women a way to speak up and have a voice. But does that truly hold water today? I want you to think, without a show of hands, who here believes that honestly, that the U of A has your back if you were to come up and speak? Especially taking into consideration that many of these cases come up against high regarded students like student athletes and also professors. Do you really believe that the campuses are going to put the words of a victim before their representation around the world? Also, a university is expected to maintain a safe campus, but fails to do so when it follows Title IX guidance. Another problem that our opponents will neglect to address is that no matter how you rework Title IX, most universities have tried to keep Title IX cases from coming up. For example, the U of A had instances where it did not do investigations when it was reported to them that there was misconduct being done on campus. As well as no matter the improvements or minor reinforcements, there will always be a gate that we must get into when it comes to calling the shots, reporting crimes, and without a key card or access in those gates, victims will not approach the platform to seek help. The regulations set forth by this platform will always be dishonest and unfair. And for this reason, no matter what our opponents come up with the power left in the hands of the universities, this will continue and never be resolved. And an issue that will continue to come up is even that when universities try their best at dealing with sexual misconduct, it tends to be very lacking. The jobs tend to be rush jobs just to get it pushed underneath the rug. They usually settle with the victims just so they can keep the victims' voices from being heard from the media. This is why we want to implement a student-ran program, because unlike the universities that mandated to go forward with allegations that have been brought forward with this administration, will be for the accuser and the accused. If the victim wants to just have a place where they can talk without being pressured to speak, they can if they want to. If victims want help on deciding whether to press charges or not, they can also do that as well. Unlike Title IX, where the colleges are mandated to report to the police and also press charges if a student has filed a complaint, this will not be the case under the student-ran program, because we feel that most students want more of a place to speak and less of being pushed into the limelight to try and push some narrative that this campus is trying to do the best. That way they can get the funding through the government. As our opponents said, through their program, the campuses must do something. Just because they must do it doesn't mean that they will. Title IX now says they must report. They don't always report. Title IX must do this. Title IX does not always do that. As well as she said that if they were to push their program would not require them to report. But the problem is that without getting rid of Title IX in sexual misconduct cases, the ruling that they must report will still hold true. So even if their program doesn't have to report, and if it's brought up to Title IX then will have to report it. And for that reasons, vote for the AF. Thank you.
Okay. So now we're going to be moving on to the last speech of round one. Emma's going to come up here and speak for another 4 minutes, and then we're going to start round two. But before we do that, we're going to go ahead and try and summarize the events for the audience. So Emma, you have the floor.
Okay. There you go. Hi, guys. Okay, so I'm going to focus on some more of the policy issues. I know our opponents brought up due process, which is actually covered under the 14th Amendment. So I'm going to talk about why it doesn't make sense that there could be no federal intervention, but then also they're going to ask for certain processes to be like honored completely and fully to the same extent and with the same efficiency. And then also kind of talk about our plan in general. So I just want to start my opening tonight by reiterating, obviously, that we're both here for the same reason, because we think that people's rights should be ensured across the country, especially students on college campuses, because it's incredibly important. So going forward, I kind of want to make another comment in terms of some of the language of the opponent's arguments, is this is not a women's issue. So Title IX is something that stems from, like, its basis is within the Civil Rights Acts that were passed in 1964, which is what Title VII developed out of, which was actually focusing on discrimination in the workplace. But within the literature of Title IX and within the literature of Title VII, it is completely inclusive of people based on gender, and also in terms of other, like, it's protecting people for racial reasons, or for against race discrimination, ethnicity, gender, status in terms of income and sexual orientation. So we need to talk about the fact that it's supposed to be inclusive of a lot of people. So going forward, I stand in negation of the resolution. As an undergraduate student myself, I demand that I have full rights over my person, and also obviously demand that every other student be entitled to the same full rights over their person. And not only because they're entitled to these rights in the Constitution, but because the framework that our country is built upon, essentially, but because we're focusing on an issue that's on college campuses, we have to think about how incredibly important this is in terms of going forward. This is the youth of the United States, so that's going to be next generations. This completely like shapes the culture and social norms and whatnot going forward. So we need to talk about what plan has better solvency and what plan works better in terms of basically the main points of going over. By removing the federal government and federal funding, there's no way that we can adequately hold groups accountable. I think that's a really cool idea, and maybe students could be part of the end decision in terms of reforming Title IX and how it works, but we can't ask a group of students to randomly form and be able to cover all these issues and handle all these different issues, especially when it's expanding to protecting the rights of people regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. There's no way that we can just sit around with no plan in place for the time being and ask a bunch of students to hopefully like have some kind of like miracle performance that they'll be able to like produce all these like outcomes and solve all these problems that all these like federal government, police, groups on campus, trained officials have not been able to do so far. So to me, that just doesn't really seem like a very realistic plan. I also just want to talk about some of the, there's a lot of mention of like campuses in terms of like how these issues would be handled. It's not like one university is like one administrator is handling these problems by themselves. This is inclusive of a bunch of different people, as my partner highlighted in her opening. And so it's not like some, like we either have like more restorative justice rehabilitation opportunities for people who have offended, people who have been part of it in terms of anonymity and talking about everybody, like survivors as well. It's not just like one administrator is handling it in our plan, so I just want to clarify that we don't expect that to be a realistic plan either. But in response to the other flaws, I think it's just very important to highlight that it's unrealistic in terms of their plan text that they're providing. It's not anything about the characters or moral commitments or ethical commitments of that group of students. I totally think that would be a really awesome plan if it was applicable in this situation, but it's just that the reason why we have the federal government intervene in these areas is so, like, for the protection of the people that Title IX is trying to protect in general. And it's not anything about, like, those students being bad, but it's basically, it doesn't make sense that we would reassign power that right now rests on, like, a separated, separated powers of three different aspects of government, including then like referring to the police force in a lot of situations, that we'd reassign all of that to one student-led group who would, or one like, I think they talked about trained officials on campus with no like accountability. The main thing here is that we have to talk about the accountability in terms of how the funding works. Is if you do something like that, it's like everything is left up to discretion. And so assuming that those individuals are, I'm sorry, I just lost thing. Assuming that those individuals are like 100% trained and like perfect all the time, like maybe there would be an instance in which that could work out, but I don't really think that's reasonable. And I think the main thing is we just can't leave students, faculty, and staff of all different races, genders, ethnicities, and sexual orientations with no plan or protection for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you. So that was the end of round one. We had our opening statements from our two opening statements from both our affirmative and negative sides. So what I'm going to do right now before we get into round two, which is cross-examination, is try to kind of synthesize the arguments that were made by both sides and give the each team an opportunity to make any clarifications if need be. So again, the motion is Title IX should not be used to address campus sexual misconduct. The affirmative side of this debate, they pretty much say that by addressing sexual misconduct through Title IX on college campuses, that there's a clear disregard of due process that is an issue for all parties in play, that there's a corruption and a lack of follow-through from the universities due to conflict of interest and due to also a disbelief in the trust of the university system. Furthermore, they say that there's no way to truly revise Title IX because all of these inherent problems and inherent flaws in terms of conflict of interest, in terms of lack of trust, are not going to be suitable for any type of real change. They also provide a alternative that is having safe spaces with legal specialists and bridging the gap with police, essentially saying that students should have the option to pursue criminal action, but not have a type of system that is adjudicated by the university system. Now at this time, I'm going to give the affirmative side any chance to clarify anything that I just said. No? All right, awesome. Then we have the negative side of the debate for the motion. Again, Title IX should not be used to address campus sexual misconduct. So the negative side, they pretty much are advocating for keeping Title IX, saying that it's an essential part, having campus adjudication is important, and that the main thing that they should be doing is, or that we all should be doing, is revising the Title IX as it exists currently. And that ultimately, having a federal mandate is going to keep the university systems accountable. They counter the affirmative saying that it's unrealistic to assume that without a mandate that things would get done. And that's pretty much what I got from it. Is there anything else that the negative team wants to add or clarify? Nope? All right. Okay. So now we're going to move on to round two, which is cross-examination for time. So we're pretty much going to keep cross-ex until 8 p.m., so that gives us a little bit over 20 minutes. The way we're going to split it up is first we're going to have both teams, both debaters kind of cross-examining each other, and then we're going to go to audience participation. So the first part is going to be 10 minutes, and then we're going to try and give 10 minutes towards the debaters and 10 minutes towards the audience. But if the debaters are done early, then more time for the audience. So at this time, I'm going to open it up to the debaters to ask any questions that they might have, and I'll also be chiming in as well to kind of probe some questions.
I actually have a question. So I wanted to Thanks. Good evening, everybody. So my question for our opponents is in regards to when they started talking about expanding and revising current Title IX. I remember that they specifically said that they want to address consent, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. It's a good thing to address such a topic, especially something that is especially controversial right now. But I would like some clarification in regards to, like, wouldn't you believe that that even addressing consent and like expanding this Title IX will still be ineffective unless we focus on changing the actual culture, which will truly lead to better results in how not just sexual misconduct on campuses are addressed, but sexual misconduct in general.
Yeah, we definitely 100% agree with that. I don't think at any point we said we weren't interested in doing that. I think we actually have very similar plans. It's just the reasonableness and applicability and whether or not one is going to work at this point, I think, looking at the plans, because it's definitely, I'm not sure if you want us to repeat maybe some of our impacts. Okay. Yeah. I think we do.
And then when talking about culture, a lot of times the law changes the culture. If per se, for example, the whole rise of, I would say, drug culture, when drugs became illegal, drugs became even more rampantly illegal, you know? So once you change a law, you change the culture around the law. Laws be the legalization of marijuana has made it safer and more accessible as a whole.
Yeah, and
So-
I think we definitely see that evident kind of with sexual misconduct in the campus environment, because as we continue to increase controls like you guys are advocating for, Emma, in your speech, we heard a lot about how we're gonna have more protection for the school. What I think happens when we increase controls, like I argued in my speech, is that having the university as the agent of enforcement under any revision of Title IX is going to have really wishy-washy carrying out of investigations. And it leaves a lot at the discretion of Title IX officers, like the matriculation, like the going of school of the students is currently at the discretion of the Title IX officer. So I haven't really heard your policy speak much to how you're going to respond to the issues of enforcement that we have with the university being kind of the parent and being the overseer in sexual misconduct on campus.
I would actually like to respond to that because we did address in our opening statement that our plan is to include committees that are created by personnel that are actually outside of the school, that are including attorneys and other forensic criminologists and other individuals that are trained in these skills that know about Title IX but are not affiliated with the school, and so they will be unbiased so they can actually go through a proper investigation, which does provide due process for the person who is accused as well as giving special appropriations for the victim as well. So that's what we plan to do.
If your enforcement is taking place outside of the framework of Title IX as you understand it, then what's the clash as far as is the difference in what we're implementing?
It's
Because
not outside
we're-
of Title IX. It's these committees are going to be created through Title IX because if you do not have these committees, that's when Title IX, through Title IX, the federal government can take away funding for your university for not providing the school with these committees.
Also, just to reiterate that, essentially, the difference in terms of the plan we laid out is that we just have that accountability of the federal government, whereas when I'm saying you're advocating, you brought up due process a number of times, which is directly, that's through the federal government. So that's kind of what we're saying is it's not like a situation in which the federal government is going to be overbearing, but they still need to be there in some
Well,
context.
it's already in the
So-
status quo overbearing, as we've seen.
So that's why we want to change it as well.
So I have a really quick
But
question
you're
for both
implementing more
teams.
controls in order to make it less stringent. I don't see how that's,
So really quick, sorry, I don't mean to cut anybody off. I think what's coming down to it, and another question I did want to ask is essentially, what are the advantages or disadvantages to using the university system versus, I guess, the criminal justice system as a whole? Because I think that's pretty much what you two are boiling, or both teams are boiling down to.
yeah, I think we'll defer to them to hear some of the advantages of what using university enforcement as opposed to something like the police or outside enforcement might be.
Okay. So, yeah, you can go.
Okay, so just mostly what kind of I was saying in mine is looking at so if you look at any court cases that have determined the ways that police go through their daily lives and context, there's a lot of discretion, right? That's left up to these different groups that you guys are proposing using. We've proposed using some of the same outlets and some of the same groups. We've also proposed them other than the police, but by including the federal government in some senses, the university programs, there's a way to make sure that everyone is held accountable and make sure that there's that level of insurance of process you're talking about, due process, as opposed to just kind of letting individuals, student groups and police without regulations kind of or as opposed to regulations determine what happens in these cases. I think
Yeah,
it
and
was-
then with going off what you said about relying simply on police, there is a large majority of victims who do not feel comfortable reporting to the police. 4.5 of sexual harassment cases were reported to the police out of all sexual harassment cases that have ever happened. 68% of those reports were said to be not useful. There are police, I'll give you an example, in Springfield, Illinois, people who reported 200 investigations to the Springfield police, they've destroyed like 200 rape kits since 2010, and at least 108 were destroyed before the statute of limitations expired. 75% of those kits were destroyed without police submitting the evidence. And only 23% of incidents of rape and sexual assault were reported to the police at all. And we have seen, especially as I mentioned with the current policies that are going on at Yale University that I cited as an example of where this system that we proposed works, they've had an uptake in people reporting and receiving resources. So if only 23% of incidents are reported to the police and much more are being reported to the university, wouldn't it make more sense for people to be allowed to have the option to report to your university if you want to?
Yeah, so I'm glad we brought up kind of like some historical context of how cases like this play out when they are brought to the university. I'd like to ask you guys, how have you historically seen universities and Title IX offices respond when they are under fire and when there's pressure on them amidst a public sexual assault allegation that, you know, is in the national eye? Do you typically see that that's beneficial for the best interest of the victims, or are you seeing that university behavior is generally in their own best interest, overlooking the victims as we argue?
I think, just really quickly, I think you're making the exact same point we're making, but you're coming at it from a different angle, of that it cannot be left to individual groups, like individual universities, individual police departments, individual student groups, individuals on campus, without some type of like regulation in terms of like the way the United States is structured is based on the separation of powers, so that there's all this red tape and kind of slowness before plans are implemented and decisions are made, so that like there's more protection of individuals as opposed to like leaving stuff to discretion and like the individual decisions that are made in exactly what you're talking about in cases like that.
So you guys want to implement like more clearly cut like wording in the rules that like kind of define the way that universities have to respond given a certain situation? Or
I believe that we mandated in our plan that these committees that we have are going to go through a specific investigation that would be similar to what the criminal justice system is supposed to do. But as we have seen through our evidence, they don't go through these investigations. And so if the federal government is mandated through their federal funding that these schools go through these investigations and it's shown that they're being held accountable, then these things will actually be implemented and they will be done well. Because currently what the problem is that there isn't that clear-cut language of this is specifically what we need to do to solve this.
so you think there is clear-cut language that can be used to address sexual issues?
It's not as much like focusing on the specific language. It's more so exactly what she was talking about in terms of like, obviously maxims and legal principles have to be reasonably vague so that they aren't applied in ways that are like counterproductive to what they're trying to do. But I think she made a really good point in terms of like, that's our whole plan, is in terms of having community people who are there like on campuses who are kind of making sure that this like resource and money allocation that we've seen problems with in the past doesn't continue to go that way.
And then I also had a question for you guys. So RJ, in your speech, you talked a lot about how the appearance of the person who is making allegations, or like the appearance of whoever is being accused of sexual assault can sometimes influence the case. But you said also that universities push it under the rug and that they also push students into the limelight for their narrative. But what can stop a student-run organization who knows these big football players, who are students who know these other students, what can stop them from pushing something under the rug, from intimidating other students, from telling them, no, he's a big football player, we need him for our next game, you shouldn't do this? What holds these students accountable in these student-run systems from doing just that?
So I think something that holds these students a little bit differently is the fact that they're not getting a paycheck for what they're doing. These are people who are willing to be there and want to be there for the benefit of the people who are being accused and the accusers. So that's a big difference than somebody who's sitting in an office because they're getting a paycheck. So they're getting a paycheck from the university. These students who are going to be running this organization, they don't care if the university looks bad or good. They care about the safety of the students.
Okay.
So they're not going to focus on who it is that's being accused. They're going to focus on how do we help the students.
So this goes into the question I was going to ask actually. How do these groups form, and how dedicated are these students to like making sure that they work out, considering they have classes and all these other things?
And how can you make sure that these student groups do form?
Well, I can actually.
Really quickly, sorry, just before you answer, after this question, we're going to open it up to audience participation.
Okay, so in response to that, I would like to point out that using a local example, here in Tucson, there's over a dozen different clinics that people refer to whenever they face any sort of like criminal violations, right? They get mandated by the court to go to these counseling sessions, to do these screenings. And then also, victims of domestic violence are also given the same list and access to these sort of counselors. They're fairly cheap in regards to
I'm sorry, are you talking about nonprofit community centers?
I'm sorry?
Are you talking about nonprofit?
I think some.
Yes, and
How is that similar to student groups?
because they're already student interns. I've been to several of these counseling centers myself. There's already student interns, especially through the University of Arizona, that work in those offices that are interested in helping these sort of victims, and they themselves can actually be the leaders in trying to incorporate our plan, in which we'll actually have a more direct and individualized process for each victim and person that is accused.
Okay, so sorry, but just last thing to clarify, so the interns at these nonprofits would come to the university and start programs?
No, I mean, we didn't really get too deep into the logistics of, I guess, how we're going to bring about solvency for our student groups. I think that was kind of a suggestion that we included in our argument, that it's more of the overarching idea that student initiatives and like collaboration with federally funded and university funded faculty to advise and that are properly trained to provide counseling, working alongside students in the university setting to deal with these sorts of issues.
But didn't you guys say that faculty is mandated and required to report?
Currently, yeah, right
So-
now.
Okay.
Really quickly, before we move
Okay,
on,
thank you.
we're gonna go ahead and kind of open it up to the audience, like I said before. So if anyone does have any questions that they want to address towards either the affirmative or the negative side, or towards both, just a normal question to pose, feel free to raise your hand. I do want to preface though is that the idea here is not to debate with either team, but to simply ask a question so that they can respond to it. So if anyone does have a question, you can raise your hand and then we'll get a microphone to you. 1, 2, and then 3. Oh, am
I think we can hear it.
About that mic.
Yeah, if you just want to project.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
It's pretty quiet.
So my question is for the people who believe that Title IX should not be used to address sexual assault. So you say that your student run group is they're not going to give them the need to be there. So isn't there a chance that they might like not do as well as work because there's no incentive? Like they might get lazy with their work, or there's really no way of knowing if the students are doing the best they possibly can, because with like using federal agencies, like it's kind of like they have to do their good job or they get fired.
So I think something that most people would agree with is that even if you are getting paid, you don't always do to your best ability. I mean, people are at jobs that they don't want to be at, and they just sit there and goof around and stuff like that. I think a big part of it will be that it will be something that you'll be able to put on your transcript and put on your resume further on down the road. So that is going to be an incentive that won't be a paycheck, that isn't a money transfer getting into your bank account. Because there are people, like I said, who joke around at work all the time that aren't having the paycheck for the incentive to be there. They're not doing their jobs.
But then couldn't you also say that students who are using this as a resume pattern could simply just show up and wouldn't do anything? They're simply doing it so they can put it on a resume?
Yeah,
They're not
well,
getting paid, that's the only reason they're
I
doing
think
it?
that becomes the case, and
We
the
can-
counselors themselves should be able to filter out which students should actually deserve to be given such an opportunity to help people that are going through these serious life-altering, actions. And we should resort to.
All right, so we're actually going to move on to the next question right now. So I know the next question was up here.
Okay, so just kind of addressing the app. The NEG has the example of ELU as an example of where, their plan has been, or a similar plan has been implemented. Do you have an example of a university that has done something like what you're advocating for? Or even a community college, a program that exists that is similar to what you're advocating for that works?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see that even here at U of A. Like, for example, the initiative of Take Back the Campus, I believe it was called, or Light Up the Campus, something like that, where, activists that are passionate about making sure that people don't feel uncomfortable for their own safety on campus went around and raised money, and they put in lights across campus so that there weren't dark places when people walk around at night. Things like that. I mean, that would be just a home example. I'd like to just point out really quickly that the whole point of our debate isn't to argue for why a student group is like the end-all be-all. I think it's our burden to prove that Title IX should not be used to address sexual misconduct. And so basically, if you think that our argument is supporting that, then please consider it on the basis of that, not whether or not we can define a perfect student group. Thanks.
So I want to give the negative a chance to respond, and then we're going to go to the next question as well.
Yeah, I think just in response to that, there is a burden of I would hope that everyone wouldn't vote on the fact that Title IX should be defunded with absolutely no resolution aside from a student group that is going to be formed from people voluntarily dropping their internships at nonprofits and de-incentivizing them by not paying them, and also that they're receiving no training beforehand. But that I think is what the affirmative would be arguing against Title IX.
Okay. I know you had a question? Absolutely.
Yeah, mine's for the opposition group. So you talked about implementing a sort of universal federal definition of consent, and the one that you mentioned was from Title 10 of U.S. Code, I believe. The problem that arises for me there is that that's the Military Forces Governance Code. It deals with the armed forces and their legal system. There are differences between civilian and military law. If a civilian commits a crime, they are indicted for said crime and they stand trial. If a military personnel commits a crime, they are court-martialed and go to a military tribunal. The processes in these judicial systems are different, much more expedient and much more cut and dry on the military side, while civilians are left more gray area.
Really quickly, if you could get to your question as well.
Yeah.
My question is, how do you rationalize drawing something from military law, implementing it in civilian law, much less in a time with the most gridlock we've ever seen and lack of bipartisan cooperation? And then how do you enforce that? Because every time the Supreme Court has seen an issue of consent, they've just tossed it back to the states where it resides.
Thank you.
You said Title 10?
Yeah,
I don't think anybody brought up Title 10.
Because it says the term consent means a freely given agreement.
So we're going to give a chance for the negative side to go ahead and restate their definition so we can all be clear, both as participants and as an audience. And then they're going to have a chance to respond to your question as well.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think her point was more so focusing on language, because I totally understand what you're saying. The center of like looking at Title IX is more focused definitely on Title VII, like just because it evolved from there, not that it's the same thing, which is more like workplace harassment.
Okay.
And our focus is more so even on like predating that to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, of that the idea here is that it's inclusive of absolutely everyone. It's not like, we don't want this to be presented as like a women's issue, like as they kind of established beforehand that they're men like don't relate to the issue in the same way and don't want to pretend to. Like we don't want to exclude anyone just from the debate in general.
And then also to go off of your question that you said about enforcing military law on civilians, the reason that we had chosen this specific definition is because of how specific it is, and because of the fact that a lot of people tend to assume that consent is this large gray area. And by having such a specific definition, we're able to cover all the bases so people know what is and what is not consent. The whole thing is a much longer. If you would like me to read it for you, I totally could. But it's very, very specific, and that's why we wanted to have something that was clear-cut, very defined. I personally did not know that it was a military law. I probably should have known that beforehand, but the fact is it's very, very specific, and that's why we had chosen it as the definition that we would use across the board. So that way there's no kind of gray area for schools to implement their own definition of consent and have it be no consistency across the board.
Another question? One in the middle? Yeah, go ahead.
So the issue of whether or not there should be a law regarding campus sexual misconduct, and sexual misconduct in general, that issue aside of whether there should be a law, this is for the negative, by the way, why should Title IX be the vehicle for that law, when originally it was about integrating extracurricular activities? Why are we trying to tack on this sexual misconduct aspect to a law about what clubs you can be in?
Right, I think.
I think because it has evolved from the beginning when it was created on the basis of sports, but at the same time, it was stemming from Title VII, which was the Civil Rights Act in the workplace, which didn't allow for sexual harassment in terms of the workplace. And so Title IX specifically brought those ideas to the education system. So we didn't think that it would be appropriate to just completely scrap Title IX and try to come up with some sort of new law that essentially is doing the same thing. We want to address sexual harassment, sex discrimination, and sexual assault within the education system. So that's why we continued with Title IX and are revising it, because that's already what's written in Title IX itself. So that's why we're going off of that, because it doesn't make sense to go ahead and scrap that when we've already built a foundation, and now we're just building up the walls and the doors and the roof to actually create the full basis of the statute.
Really quickly, do you mind if I say something before your question? So I think an important thing is to actually read read Title IX itself. It is a very short kind of statute. So Title IX in and of itself says, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So that is Title IX in and of itself, just those words. So there is this vagueness, and there has been this application that has changed. So although it did start primarily for sports and those types of things, we see that the legislation in and of itself has room for growth and expansion, and that's also what we're debating here.
Also, could I add something very, very quickly? I just wanted to say also, like, in terms of like looking at how laws get formed, enacted, and then implemented and administrated among like different groups and different communities, it's just important to remember that Title VII, so what this kind of like spawned off of, actually got thrown into the 1964 Civil Rights Act as a joke. Like, it was kind of so a specific congressman threw it in, so like as like a last Hail Mary to get people of color excluded from the ratification of the amendment, and so then that's how it got written in, and we still haven't been able to pass the Equal Rights Amendment today. And so like I think there's a misconception of maybe like trust in government, of that we can overnight like create a whole new law, but that's mostly what we want to emphasize, is that like intermittent period that would like go in between the fact of just like eliminating the law and then coming up with something else, is like everybody is like put in a really vulnerable position and not guaranteed any protection.
Let me go to your question.
Right. For the affirmation side, you did say that the solution, the student groups and the nonprofits aren't really an end-all be-all solution. Is there any other examples that you could create, any other solutions aside from revising Title X if it's not a student-led committee?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main distinctions in our solution was that it's important for us to have a group on campus in some capacity that doesn't have mandated reporters, but does give students access to any resources or like next steps that they might want to take as a result of experiencing some sort of sexual misconduct. So I think we definitely are adamant about having initiatives that or providing some sort of place for students, which is distinct from Title IX, and that they can go and discuss their experiences without having fear of being blamed for something, or having their whole private story blown up, nationwide.
And just to touch on that as well, the reason why I believe that we are using these like student run and while they're under the supervision of the specialist sort of programs is because we believe that students themselves, since we are the ones living and experiencing, and we have friends and family and all these people in our lives that have actually been touched by these sort of issues, we ourselves are the best vehicle to actually change the culture, to actually focus on not just helping victims after they are attacked, but also in regards to trying to rehabilitate people that have actually been found guilty of sexual misconduct.
So we are at 8 o'clock, but I want to give the audience opportunity to ask maybe one or two more questions. We'll do one and then two, and then we'll go to closing statements. Either one.
I'll go first.
Yeah.
So does this apply to only victims and perpetrators allegedly? So like if they both have to be students? Or does this go on to someone who was accused outside of campus assaulting someone on campus who was a student? Or a student who assaulted someone who was off campus, not a student? Is that, like, how do we square that legal system with a student who was sexually assaulted? Like, yeah, pretty much sums it up.
So a problem there is that there's a very much of a gray area. If it's someone off campus, right? So if it's someone you're just walking on the U of A campus and someone who's not in the school system at all does something to you, Title IX does not cover that. That will be something that will go straight to the law enforcement in Tucson because of the fact that that person can't be affected by the U of A. Vice versa, if you're off campus and you do something, Title IX, once again, it's still a gray area, but you can still be held accountable on the U of A campus if you do something off campus because you're a student. So anything you do off campus could be held accountable on campus as well because you're a student.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, so mine's kind of similar to that. It's under the new Betsy DeVos revisions to the Title IX. I kind of have two questions for both sides. So number one, you guys want to get rid of Title IX completely and only have like students of a committee doing that kinds of stuff. So what would you say for the bias of the students on the committee? Because often with campuses as we have them now, students will know each other, and what happens when a victim is one of their friends or someone who's accused is one of their friends? How do you eliminate that bias, and how do you put that forth in your system?
So something that would happen would be almost kind of like if you're a judge and you know the person you have to recuse yourself, there will be, like we said, there will be a specialist who's the head of this committee who then will, you know, if they know that the person knows, or if the student comes to them and says, hey, I know this victim, or hey, I know the person who's being accused, well, obviously they're not going to be assigned to look over the problem that's being brought up in front of them. It would be another student that's in the program as well.
Okay. And then as for your side, so under Betsy DeVos' new, basically revisions, basically. So she's saying that there's going to be more protections for those who have been accused, that they're going to eliminate outside of campus, like accusations outside of campus will no longer be held responsible under the new Title IX. How would your plan readapt that? Or would you keep the revisions?
No, I don't think. I think that the idea, you're speaking more so of like what happens to what happens to like people who are allegedly offenders in the aftermath?
Yeah, so her new
Okay.
revisions, there's a couple. So one of them is that assaults that happen off of campus, no longer, the school is no longer responsible for them. So how would that work under your new plan? And then also, part of the plan is she wants to introduce more protections for people who've been accused. So she wants to introduce like an interrogation process, et cetera, that will protect more of the accused.
Quickly, and then you can take a feel of that. Just in terms of, like, first of all, to be very candid, no, I do not support Betsy DeVos or the majority of the plans that have happened under her as the education head. But I think, like, in terms of Kayla's going to provide kind of what's from our original plan, but also I think a main thing is in terms of offenders after the events is that we want to look more at doing kind of things like restorative justice and rehabilitation type of things, whereas like people have to be held accountable, obviously, to a certain extent, but then also that can't just be the end all be all, I think, in terms of what we want to achieve as a society as a whole. In terms of, I think, to coin a term they've used a couple of times, of changing the culture, is that happens like not through people. I think everyone in this room is, I would hope, at least like very non-supportive of sexual harassment or sexual assault or anything like that, and yet all of us have not yet been able to change the culture. So I think like being realistic, like we want to look at laws and like mandated things so that we can actually like address these issues.
Yeah. And then
What Betsy DeVos did actually.
Hold on, really quick. So we're gonna have these two final statements, and then we're gonna go on with the closing statements. I just want to kind of cut it off right now.
Oh, so I kind of wanted to respond to your question about the protections for the accused. One of the great things about what we have is that, so when thinking about like sexual assault allegations, say that those students are in the same class or it's a teacher-student situation. There are these situations where, say I have accused my partner Emma of assault. I could further like a false allegation, which are very uncommon, but I could falsely accuse her, and then if we're sitting next to each other in class, I can outrageously pretend that she's assaulted me again. I can further those false accusations if I want to. By having this system where the school can step in and that we have this committee, they can be able to remove a student from that environment, be able to work with their class schedule to help them maybe find a different class that they could be in so they don't have to deal with that. So if you are accused, you don't have to confront that person on a day-to-day basis in your class, per se, if they're in your class. And you don't have to have your name put out there as something and have it be flamboyant like that. And then especially with a student-teacher situation, if your teacher were to assault you, you'd have to sit in their class every single day or risk being harassed by them failing you. If you're going through the school can give you those protections. And especially with the federal government holding everyone accountable, you can be able to receive those protections. If it's a student-run organization, they can't necessarily help you escape a sexually abusive teacher.
And then just to briefly clarify, one of the major revisions of that Betsy DeVos had was in changing the standard of proof. Prior to her recent revisions, the standard of proof for Title IX cases was the lowest among any court system. It was called the preponderance of evidence, which means that essentially if the Title IX officer believes one side or the other of the story, 51 to 49%, or they have, hair on one end that's a little bit heavier, that enables them to make decisions about the schooling of the students in question. And they actually increased that to now I believe it's beyond a reasonable doubt or something to that effect, which actually is a small improvement among all the atrocities that we've pointed out in Title IX. It actually makes it slightly more controlled. So we actually like those.
All right, thank you so much.
Wait,
So,
one last question?
is it gonna be quick?
Since I run this.
It's gonna be really quickly.
Very quickly, I'm interested that a lot of the conversation seems like it's very, very based around physical assault, and not a whole lot of the conversation has existed around harassment and verbal assault. And I think that might be sort of an interesting avenue to go down very quickly, because obviously physical assault is something that off campus or on is written into our justice system. Whereas harassment, if you're catcalled on the street, for instance, you can't necessarily report that to the police. So I'm interested in how it is that, since it sounds like the negatives team's ideal version of Title IX has to do with specificity and how it is that is worded very specifically. So I'm interested to hear from both teams as to how it is that we can specifically include things like harassment, because harassment, I think, is more subjective, right, in terms of who's saying it, who's hearing it, than necessarily assault. So, but I'm
So
giving
really-
the app first because I kind of...
Yeah, so really quickly, I'm going to give both teams just a minute to respond to that, and then before we go into closing statements.
So the subjective nature of harassment and more speech-oriented sexual misconduct matters is made really evident actually by the way that it's applied in Title IX. And the reason for this is because we've seen numerous cases across the nation of things like professors whose eye contact may have made a student feel uncomfortable, which is potentially a problem, or a comment that someone might have made off the cuff that they didn't know one of their colleagues heard has led to someone losing their job and their credibility in the academic setting. So I'm really hoping to hear that the other team will give us a way that them making the standards more stringent will actually particularly address issues of harassment and speech and non-physical misconduct, because as we've seen in the past with hundreds and hundreds of cases, Title IX has been kind of subjectively and maybe biasly or unfairly applied, and resulted in unfair circumstances for a lot of students.
I'm gonna let my friend Casey take this one, but I just really quickly want to say that the same administration who just made those regulations that you said you guys are in support of also just put a man on the Supreme Court who is pretty undoubtedly committed a number of probably everything under the scope of sexual misconduct. So I think that's just important to highlight in terms of understanding these laws and regulations and how they're applied. But
All right, so hold on. Remember, we're going to let the negative side, they have 30 seconds left, and then we're going to go to closing statements. Got to keep this on track. Continue.
Responding to Ted's question regarding how we would respond to sexual harassment specifically, the way that Title VII deals with sexual harassment is by the term hostile environment. So we have with our investigative teams, you can actually look at the conduct that's being spoken, and if it is decided by that unbiased group of different members that there is a hostile environment being created by the harassment that is occurring, then that is deemed harassment and it can be covered.
All right, so thank you all so much. That's the end of round 2. right, so now we're going to go into round 3, which are 6-minute closing statements, and then we are all done. And then we're going to go ahead and do voting, and then that's it. So now on, you do have the floor.
Set my timer here. Good evening, everybody. Do I really need this? I'm just going to speak without it. Sorry. It's just been pretty quiet in here. I thank you all for being really respectful. Oh, it's for the camera. Okay. So in regards to, all right, let me get now. All right. So Title IX in its current incarnation is ineffective, something that my opponents and I, and hopefully all of you realize that, and agree with. But this is not because another version of this policy might solve the problem. It's because any policy in the hands of the university will, by definition, fall short. Their propositions to provide changes and more narrow definitions of Title IX will not solve the legislation's ineffectiveness. Rather than keeping the non-discriminatory factors of Title IX and leave crimes to be handled by the police, my opponents argue that schools themselves are better suited to investigate and punish these sorts of heinous offenses. My partners and I are not saying that schools must completely remove themselves from student affairs and ignore these sort of crimes that happen on their campus. Schools will be required to provide accommodations determined on a case-by-case basis with guidance from the judicial system and specialists that seek to assist victims of sexual misconduct. A study in the Brookings Institute showed that students believe the best method to addressing sexual misconduct and dangerous cultures on campuses is by providing students with environments where the victims and respondents can receive assistance. Just as the judicial system provides indigent defendants with legal assistance when they face incarceration for criminal offenses, our plan will provide students with legal, emotional, psychological, and medical support. Students will be able to request a rape kit and other forms of forensic testing. While we are aware of the criticism against law enforcement responsiveness to sexual misconduct, our plan attacks one of the direct issues with low response and reporting rates by increasing the confidentiality students have with counselors, legal counsel, when they are discussing their independent case. Universities across the nation have become paranoid after the Dear Colleague letter was distributed under the Obama administration. In the letter, the administration called for more thorough investigations by schools, but provided no guidance in doing so. Our plan is to provide resources for all parties involved in sexual misconduct. The Dear Colleague letter also promotes the single investigator model, which has evidently shown to undermine students and mishandle sexual misconduct allegations. I would like to clarify that the single investigator model does not necessarily mean that there is a single Title IX investigator or a single campus administrator that is investigating these sort of allegations. It simply means that the school themselves is the single investigator in that specific case. They do not necessarily allow for assistance from outside of the school. They also regularly do not suggest that students should seek assistance outside of the school. My partners and I refuse to allow the mandatory reporting policy to prevent more victims from coming forward and seeking help. Students will be more willing to report crimes committed against them when discussing with psychological counselors and legal counsels that are completely confidential. Victims may struggle to find correct legal information regarding what happened to them. Victims may also need emotional support with a sense of security before they decide to move forward with their case. Rather than mandatory reporting, school faculty should, rather than mandating school faculty file a report against the victim's wishes, thus ruining their autonomy, students should feel confident that who they discuss their situation with will remain confidential. Although my opponents have brought up that they also plan on getting rid of this mandatory reporting, it is highly unlikely that schools themselves will be able to act in a way that is unbiased, because schools naturally have that incentive to try to cover themselves in order to be able to continue receiving the sort of federal funding. Colleges across the nation also frequently fail to provide students with individualized paths to re-enter the college environment. Victims will determine how they will re-enter the college environment in our program. When they need a leave of absence, counseling that may interfere with coursework, and most importantly, time to heal, students should have a right to do so and make arrangements with the university by guidance under the judicial system. Our plan also includes providing psychological assistance, legal help, and a place to track their progress for students who have been found guilty of sexual misconduct. Title IX and the Dear Colleague letter have done nothing for parties involved in sexual misconduct case after the case itself has reached a conclusion. Victims are left on their own because they do not have access to confidential counseling and a safe space. Those determined guilty by law to have committed sexual misconduct regularly dodge counseling by transferring schools and not being required to do so. Our team firmly believes that Title IX in the 2011 Dear Colleague letter is feeding rape culture on college campuses by ignoring victims who need assistance and offenders who must be rehabilitated and monitored before reintegrating into the classroom. Betsy DeVoe's recent rescindment of the controversial 2011 Dear Colleague letter is no step closer to actively responding to sexual misconduct, underreporting, repeated victimization, due process violations, or overarching culture of college campuses. Although DeVoe and the Department of Education has decided to suggest schools get rid of the single investigator model, they have not provided schools with an impartial decision maker. What must occur is the creation of an administration independent from schools who conduct their own investigations and mandate schools to provide accommodations to students when necessary. The reason we also reject the single investigator model is because multiple hearings for students, independent cases can be miscommunicated, misrepresented, and warped by the media. Students in our plan will have the freedom to discuss their situations, ask questions regarding their options to take legal action while giving victims control of what they want to do. Current Title IX assistance undermines victims by stripping away their autonomy and exposing to the public what happened to them. Title IX provides no guidelines for indicating the form of sexual misconduct that exists on the spectrum, but our proposition will focus on identifying misconducts that range from a subjectively determined offense and a objectively recognized offenses that are so severe and pervasive that no person can be expected to endure. Universities are inherently hierarchies that naturally seem unresponsive to victims and respondents of instances of sexual misconduct. When colleges were threatened with federal fund reduction, their incentive to investigate allegations of sexual misconduct resulted in two equally radical and opposite results. Hundreds of investigations to school compliance with Title IX have resulted with evidence suggesting internal cover-ups, and colleges have lowered their standards of evidence used to determine guilt in wrongful convictions. I strongly urge you to vote in the affirmative and that we seek other forms to handle sexual misconduct besides ineffective legislation. Thank you.
All right, so we move on to our last closing statement from the negative side. Casey, you do have the floor.
Okay, everybody. So I would like to start my speech by addressing what the affirmative team has said on this matter. I would like to point out the fact that their plan only focuses on students and doesn't address the fact at all that faculty are capable of conducting sexual harassment and misconduct violations against their students. Their plan has no way of solving for this problem, as ours clearly does, because the school is mandated to take action to make sure that students are protected from these faculty members, and so that faculty members don't have any sort of incentive to go after their students in this manner, which we have seen happen before Title IX had started. I'd also like to point out the fact that federal funding being given to these schools in order to do investigations requires these schools to go forward with investigations. So if we clearly point out what needs to be done in an investigation by a committee, that's the only time that federal funding is going to be cut from these schools, and it makes sure that the schools are being held accountable to make sure that these things happen. With their plan of having these student-led organizations, there is no funding involved. They don't have any way to actually put in funding that protects these students, that gives them the option to go seek treatment, to get physical or mental health services that they need. They don't provide any funding for this, whereas our plan does. I would also like to point out the fact that their plan talks about de-incentivizing jobs that are supposed to be helping students, but they have zero confidentiality in their plan. These students can go to whoever they want and report that whatever someone comes and says to them without any sort of confidentiality. Schools mandate that through these investigations, they have to remain confidential throughout the entire investigation. They can't come out and give names of who is being accused or who is the accuser. All of that has to be kept private. When you're going to a public trial through the criminal justice system, the person who is being accused, his name gets out there, his or her name gets out there, and they don't have the sort of protections that happen when these things occur on school grounds. I'd also like to point out the fact that these students are not required to have any formal training that they're being given in these organizations, whereas schools have to have formal training. So with their whole plan of having students that will do these things to try and help other students, they have no actual way of making sure that these students are prepared to take care of actual victims and survivors and people who have gone through trauma. They're not psychiatrists. They might have one psychiatrist that runs the whole thing, but that doesn't mean that these students are actually prepared to help these other students and help these victims. They also don't provide any protections against retaliation, specifically like what I said regarding faculty members. If a faculty member wants to retaliate against a student who had reported a sexual harassment allegation, the school can't interfere in any way. So that faculty member could fail you as a student because they didn't want you to report them. So they threaten you with a failing grade, not taking you to conferences. They'll give you all of these incentives to have sexual intercourse with them, and the school doesn't do anything about it. They have no incentive to stop that behavior from happening under their plan. The alternative provides no clear solution to this problem. It, in fact, makes things worse. So if you think that Title IX isn't working right now, by completely getting rid of Title IX practices entirely, you're making the situation so much worse. With our plan, we're actually trying to provide a solution and fix these problems that Title IX is currently having to make the situation better rather than making it worse. I'd also like to point out the fact that the affirmative team had stated that you can get outside services that are court mandated, but according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, fewer than 1 in 5 female students, 16% victims of rape and sexual assault, received assistance from a victim services agency. So this doesn't actually occur in their world. They don't have anybody protecting these students because students don't actively go for these resources. It's just not happening. I'd also like to point out the fact that they say that with our plan, we're not protecting victims, but actually 46, according to what was going on in the Yale Commission that we had talked about, 46% contacted the Share Center, 30% said that this was very useful, and 27.9% said that this was an extremely useful resource, according to their campus climate survey, which is completely anonymous and is completely separate from the school. It's actually conducted by a separate organization, so the school can't manipulate these numbers whatsoever. 35.4% reported to a Title IX coordinator, and 40% believe that this was extremely useful. And in comparison to that, 4.5% reported to the city police, and 68% said that it was not effective in solving their case at all. I'd also like to point out the fact that our plan addresses men and women. They tried to make the statement that we are only trying to protect women, and that is not true at all. Men are victimized at 17%, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And the campus sexual assault study of 2007 found that 6.1% of college males reported experiencing attempted or completed sexual assault since entering college. Feelings of shame, confusion, and self-blame may lead to men suffering in silence after being sexually assaulted. We are trying to fix for these issues to make it so that more men can come out and report to these confidential agencies that there was an injustice that happened to them. So we are actually trying to destigmatize what is going on to men as well as women. This is not a women's issue. This is everybody's issue. I'd also like to point out that all of the good things that have happened since Title IX's implementation, in part as a result of these inequalities, only 8% of women aged 19 and older were college graduates in 1970, according to the U.S. Department of Justice. According to the World Bank, as data of 2017, women make up 60% of college graduates. So it's clear that since 1970s, when these policies were implemented, we have shown a change. So if you vote for the negative team, you're voting to make things better. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone who is debating on the negative side, everyone who debated on the affirmative side. Right now, what we're going to be doing is the final voting. So go ahead and, again, our markers for what each color represents are up on the board. Green is if you're siding with the affirmative. Orange or red is if you side for the negative, and the yellow is for undecided. So go ahead and do that, and then we'll get those votes tallied up. All right. So we do have the... Hello, everyone. So really quickly, we actually do now have the results and the tallies of tonight's debate. So if you give me just a little bit of time. So the total votes before were 10 for the affirmative, 10 for the negative, and 68 undecided. Now, after the debate, we have 25 votes for the affirmative, 27 votes for the negative, and 8 undecided. Yeah, the boxed ones. So, with the side that ended up persuading more people was the negative side. So we see that the negative side has won by 2. So congratulations.